So today we're looking at the story of Gideon and the Midianites. And this is one of these stories, a lot like we were looking at last week, where there's several strands that run through the story, kind of several themes that run through the story. And some are at quite odds with each other. Now, to understand the context of this a little bit, we need to kind of understand the book of Judges. Gideon stands as sort of the chronological core of the book of Judges, even though it occurs in about the first third of the book as far as space-wise goes. But last week we looked at the story of Joshua and the story of Jericho, and that occurs, somewhere around 1400, 1350 BC, somewhere around that time. And then the book of Judges occurs after the book of Joshua. And the book of Judges is one of these really tragic books in the Old Testament where the people of Israel, they've come into the land, but they don't fully possess it. They have like pockets throughout the land of Canaan. And during the book of Judges, what happens is the people forget the Lord their God, and then they fall into oppression. They cry out to the Lord. God raises up a deliverer, known as a judge, who then brings deliverance to the people of Israel. And so you have Nathaniel, Ehud, Deborah we've looked at in the past with her defeat of King Jabin and his general Sisera. And then right after her comes Gideon. Later on in the book, and these are just the major judges. There's a lot of small ones. For example, at the very end of the story of Gideon, you'll get Jotham, who's going to rise up, and he actually has to deliver Israel against Gideon's family. But I don't put him on there because he's sort of a minor judge. And then Jephthah, and then Samson. At the very end of the book, we transition into sort of the last judge, but he's not called a judge, and that would be Saul. No, I saw that out there. That shouldn't be Saul. That should be Samuel, who then is going to lead us into the kingdom with. He's going to anoint King Saul. Now, as I was saying, Deborah occurs right before Gideon, and she defeats King Jabin, who is sort of up by the Sea of Galilee towards the coast, sort of modern-day southern Lebanon, and he has basically ruled northern Israel during this time. But he's oppressed the people of Israel. And one of the reasons why he's able to oppress them is he actually has chariots. Because he's down on the coastal plains, you can have horses and chariots. The people of Israel are up in the mountains. And it doesn't make much sense to have chariots if you're inhabiting the mountains. And we're going to see this is important today because when we look at the story of Gideon, the way the Midianites are able to wreak havoc on the land of Israel is they have camels. They're coming out of the desert, and so they have camels. They're able to travel very, very quickly. But when Deborah defeats King Jabin, this creates a huge power vacuum within Israel. No longer do you have a Canaanite king ruling the land. You really have no one with a substantial army or military presence there to bring peace to the land. So as a result, these raiding tribes out of sort of the Jordanian and south of modern-day Jordan, the Amalekites and the Midianites, are able to come in with their camels and raid Israel. And so they come on raiding parties once a year. And so this brings us into the context of the story. Now, the story of Gideon really begins in chapter 6. And it starts at chapter 6, where it tells us that the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord turned them over to Midian for 7 years. The Midianites overwhelmed, and this is really kind of cut and pasted, so if you've got a Bible, you can look it up and read see the whole context for yourself. But the Midianites overwhelmed Israel, and whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites would attack them. So it's right when the crops are coming to fruition that the Amalekites and Midianites would then come on their raiding parties into Israel, and they basically take the crops and their animals in the early fall. They invaded the land, devoured its crops all the way to Gaza. They left nothing for the Israelites to eat. and they took away the sheep, the oxen, and the donkeys. So you can see that once King Jabin was gone, it really opened the land up for this sort of raiding and pillaging. Now, kind of a lot like, once Saddam Hussein was gone, and then we come in, and then we try and build up the Iraqi army, but the Iraqi army is not strong enough, and so you get, this new group, ISIS and other groups, that are then able to sweep in and take vast areas of territory, because even though there might be an army there, they don't understand the new Iraq, they don't understand the new military, they don't have a lot of allegiance to what's going on there. It's not a great parallel, but it's about the closest one I can think of today. Then it continues on in chapter 6, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites. In other words, things got so bad that they went, oh wow, maybe we should cry out to God again. So then God appointed a prophet and sent it to the people, and you get this anonymous prophet who comes along, and he says to them, thus says the Lord your God of Israel. Now, the thus says the Lord your God of Israel should immediately bring us back to the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Okay, so you see right at the very start, you get an echo of the Shema taking place within this passage. Then the prophet says, I led you up from Egypt, and I brought you out of the house of slavery. I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. So right at the very start of the story, we get the context. This is a theological story, and you get the context of what's taking place here. But the key thing I want you to notice here is all these verbs. I led, I brought, I delivered, I drove, I gave. All these verbs. And one of the things that we're going to see here in this story is the way the verbs go. It's going to start out very, very high on Yahweh, and by the end of the story, God's going to be absent. And it's going to start out very, very low on Gideon, and by the end of the story, Gideon's doing everything. And so we're going to see this transference that takes place, and that's one of the huge tragedies that takes place in this story, is this changing of the main or the central character. Now, this story really occurs in 3 sections, and because David brought the high school group here, we can look at this as maybe 3 pages to a comic book, and on each page of the comic book you've got 3 pictures, so 3 sections, and each one will have sort of 3 scenes in each section. And I actually downloaded a theme for my presentation software that did comic books, and I started doing this in comic books, but it just got a little bit too convoluted. And the other thing is that my artwork isn't as good as my idea, and so I decided to go with a more straight textual outline here. So I apologize to the high school group here if I'm not up to your high standards. So section 1, we get the call of Gideon. And right at the very front here, you get this messenger, this angel of the Lord appearing to Gideon, and it says, the Lord is with you, courageous warrior. Now, one of the things we're going to see as we go through this story is, this is a real oxymoron. This guy is not very much of a warrior, and he's not very courageous either. But this is how he's addressed very, very right at the start. And Gideon has his doubts when he's called. And so he prepares this meal. He thinks that this is some great person, a dignitary, a prophet, or something like that. He's not quite sure who it is. He prepares this meal to honor the person, but when he prepares it and sets it before him, it's consumed by fire, and it's gone. And all of a sudden, Gideon realizes that there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. Section 2 here comes along, and what takes place here in the section 2 is that Gideon is in the town of Ophrah, and his father has an Asherah, or sort of like an idol that is set up for the worship of Baal. And now this is really key as we go through the story. This is one of these themes that's going through. We got, I am the Lord your God. At the start, you shall worship me, but you have not, and so I brought the Midianites. The problem is when the people came into the land, and we've been talking about this, how much do the people of Israel understand? How much do they know? And it looks like after Joshua is dying, we've gone into the book of Judges, they're taking and they're mixing their religion and Yahweh with local traditions and religions also that they found in the land when they came in. And Gideon's father has got this idol or small temple set up for the worship of Baal. Baal is a Canaanite god that ruled with the heavens. So, like when you see a great storm coming and you've got the thunder and the lightning and all that, they would really see that as a demonstration of Baal. This is Baal's presence coming in this storm. So Gideon's father has got this temple set up. And God's first charge to Gideon is to destroy this idol. So, courageous warrior that he is, what's he do? He does it at night. He cuts it down at night. And the other thing that he does is he takes an ox that his father has saved, because we know that in the temples for Baal, they would sacrifice oxen in these temples. So he takes what looked like this sacrificial ox out, builds a new altar, and sacrifices the ox on that. So when the people wake up in the morning, they see, A, the temple of Baal is destroyed, and B, the sacrificial bull is now sacrificed on this new stone altar out here. And they are really, really quite upset about this whole thing. They want to kill Gideon. And his father then comes to his defense, and he says, if Baal really is God, let him defend himself. In other words, if Baal is God, let him get revenge on Gideon. You don't have to do it. And for this reason, in verse 32, Gideon is then named Jerub Baal, which means he contends with Baal. Now, that should immediately let you know what's going on in this story here. It's about Yahweh, and Gideon is put in a place where he's going to contend against Baal. He is bringing the people back to Yahweh, and he is fighting not against the Midianites so much. He is fighting against Baal. So, we go to scene 3. And the scene 3 is the famous one with the fleece. And you all know the story where Gideon lays out the fleece and he says, if you really want me to lead this battle, make the whole threshing floor wet, but the fleece be dry. So God does that, and then he says, do it again. And then he says, okay, this time, the third night, let's make the fleece wet and the threshing floor dry. And God does it each time in all these things. Now, what we miss in all this is that, going back to Baal, Baal is the god of storms and rains and all this sort of stuff. His daughter, Tal-Eanya, in that language actually means she is the goddess of dew. And so when Gideon asked for these demonstrations using dew with this fleece, it's a slam against Baal and the worship of Baal, especially his daughter, who commands the dew. And the dews were very important there, because this is one of the ways that you irrigate your crops and stuff like that. I mean, it's a desert, so any moisture you can get is good. So these clouds that would come off the Mediterranean with fog and dew were very, very important to them agriculturally. So here with the fleeces, it's an attribution that who God is, but on the other hand, what it's saying is that Yahweh commands the dew. Baal doesn't. God's in charge of the dew. I can make it do what I want in all these things. And so you get the dew, and this whole thing of the dew is mentioned 4 times in that story. So you get Jerub Baal, I contend against Baal. You get the story of the dew that comes along, and so it helps you get things. Now, a little bit about the Midianites and the Amalekites and how they attack Israel. In the very middle there, I've got Ophrah in the red. And I've got the ancient highways. I pulled up ancient highways in red here also, so you can see the major trade routes. Now what happens is the Amalekites and the Midianites come up, and they come up through one of these valleys here, and they're camped near this town called Endor. So they've come from sort of the south and from the east out of the desert, and they're riding their camels, so they've got speed, and they're able to cross vast distances and do things that the Israelites just can't. So Gideon then, now that I've had his 3 tests with God and the fleece, calls the tribes of Israel together, and they kind of come and they surround this camp. But the first thing they realize is they're outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. There's way too many Amalekites, and they've got technology we don't have. They have camels. Now, if you've ever been around camels, you realize that you may not want to call them technology, but it's far superior than what they have. So they camp around them in the valley of Jezreel there. Now we come to scene 2, the battle. And in scene 2, in the battle here, what we're going to have is the first scene is the army's too big. So you get this story of where Gideon comes forward and says, if anyone has fear in their hearts, you can go back to your houses. Now we're going to see that they really don't go back to their houses. It's more like they pull back to secondary camps. And you'll see how that comes in the story here. But he lets them go back. And then he says, God says, the army's still too big. I want you to bring all the men down, and you're going to lap water like a dog. Those who lap water like a dog, I'm going to keep. But those who keep their spear in one hand and are, cupping water, they're going to kneel and cup water, those you're going to dismiss. Now, once again, going back to Baal, this is important. And this is important for 2 reasons. First off, when we talk about the inerrancy of Scripture, I'm sorry, but there's a major problem here. Dogs do not lap water. Okay? Dogs, what we call punch and bite. Cats, those, detestable creatures that probably should not be in houses, lap. They lick the water and they get it up. Dogs punch and bite. What they do is they thrust their tongue down into the water and they pull it back. And what happens is, like a little column of water comes up, and then they bite it. This is why, if you've ever had dogs and they have a dog bowl, they take a drink, and when they walk away, there's a trail of water behind them because they've got it all over their mouth and everything else. They're not like, cats or any other animal that licks the water and lap it up. So, now we've got this major error in the Bible out of the way. We're going to go to the second thing. Why does God select those who get down on all fours and lap the water? Why are they chosen? Well, you need to go back to Baal again. In the temples, in the ruins of temples, we have priests offering up sacrifices before the altar of Baal. And guess who is sitting by his side or behind him? A dog. Dogs were central in the Canaanite and the Phoenician religions in the worship of Baal. So just like the dew, when God says, you're just going to pick the ones who lap water like a dog, I think is a slam against Baal. In other words, you think Baal commands the rains and the dew. He doesn't. You think God commands the dog. Well, you're wrong. I've got control over dogs, even people who act like dogs. And so he brings them into his army here as well. So now we're down to 300 men. And Gideon still, the great courageous warrior that he is, still isn't convinced. So God says, take your servant, do a night mission, go down into the camp of the Amalekites, and I'll give you proof that you're going to win. And so they go down there, and one of the people in the camp is sitting there in verse 13, and he tells his comrade, and he says, behold, a cake of barley tumbled down into the camp. It struck the tents, so it fell and turned upside down. And this striking and turning upside down are language that are used in this story and other military stories where it can be striking with the sword and then the army being uprooted or thrown over. So it can be, literally can talk about, something hitting something else, but there are also verbs that get used in these stories about military conquest. So it's got kind of this play on words here that's going on. And so immediately Gideon realizes, wow, if even the foreigners are being, this truth is being revealed to the foreigners, I can do it. And it says Gideon worshiped God. And so you see Gideon, he worships God. He cuts down his father Baal. He makes an altar. He sacrifices the bull on it. And now out here he worships again. And also he worshipped when the messenger came along. So Gideon's got a pretty good start in the story going so far. Let me see. Okay. Then we come to the third scene in the battle scene, and this is the one with the battle itself, where he takes those 300 men Each man has a torch, he has a pot, he has a horn, and he has his sword. And so he tells the men to put the torches in your pot so no one will see them. He gives each man a horn, and he divides them into three groups, so they go and they surround this much larger Amalekite army at night. And then when Gideon gives the word, they smash their pots and pull out their torches, so now everything's lit up. They blow their horns, and they shout, "A sword for the Lord." And so you get this great outcry that's taking place. Now you can imagine, it's pitch dark, it's the middle of the night, you're sleeping in the Amalekite camp, and all of a sudden all these torches light up, and you have all these people shouting, and you have the trumpets. Now, when Joshua attacked Jericho, he only had 7 trumpets. When Gideon attacks the Amalekite camp, he's got 300. And so you can imagine the Amalekites, when they wake up and they see these torches, and there's 300 horns blaring, and these people are shouting all this, they just go into a state of utter confusion and disarray. And what's interesting in the story there, do I have it here? No, I don't. Yeah, I want to make sure that I don't. Well, anyways, it's probably going to come up on another slide here later on. What's really interesting is even though the people shout out, "A sword for the Lord," that's what Gideon commands them to do. When they actually shout it out, they shout out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." So there's a transition that's taking place in the story here. It's no longer God's doing this. Now God does it, and Gideon does it. The other thing that's interesting in this story is the Israelites don't kill the Midianites. It's in their confusion, in the darkness, and they're running around trying to figure out what's going on. They're killing each other with their own swords in the whole thing. So it's not even God, Gideon or the Israelites doing it. It is the Midianites doing it here. But going back to our little map here once again, what happens is they attack them in this sort of threefold movement, this surprise thing at night. And what the Midianites are shocked, they're disarrayed, they don't know what's going on. And so they flee down the valley, they go down to the Jordan River, and they are backtracking. And we're going to take a look here in a bit as to where all these other armies, these other people that Gideon dismissed because they were fearful, where they went in the process here. Now we come to the third scene here. And this is the pursuit and revenge part of the story. We go into chapter 8. So the Midianites are in retreat, disarrayed. The people of Israel are pursuing them and attacking them from the rear. Now in this story here, we have a real change in verbs. They're going down, and I'll show you where they're going here in a minute here. As they're chasing the Midianites, they come to the town of Succoth. This is an Israeli encampment. This is an Israeli town. They come to the people of Succoth and they say, "Please give us loaves of bread to the people. They are exhausted, and I am pursuing the kings of Midian." And the people there, you can understand, they realize that Gideon hasn't defeated them. He's chasing them. He hasn't caught their kings or anything like this. And they realize it's a much larger army. And so you can understand they're a little hesitant to switch allegiances or to give Gideon support at this point in time, because if they do and Gideon loses, they're in big trouble. Because the people of Succoth and their town Peniel do not give them supplies, Gideon then says, "When the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna, however you say his name, into my hand, I will flail your flesh." And so that you get this, "I will flail your flesh. When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower." So the city had a tower. And then it talks about that he goes out, he captures the kings, and the army is more or less routed. The Midianites are fleeing. He comes back then to Peniel and Succoth, and then he takes the elders of the city, and he takes thorns out of the wilderness and briars. He flails their flesh with these briars. He breaks down the defensive towers of their cities, and he kills the men of the city. And so you see, here's a man who's meant to deliver Israel, but when now he has his victory and he comes back, now he's actually more aggressive against his own people than he was against the foreign kings. And so I was saying I was going to show what takes place. So the Midianites in the yellow, they flee down the valley there, and Israel is pursuing them. And I was saying that these 20,000 men that got dismissed because they were fearful, and then all the people who knelt and took water from their hands. When you read the story, you realize that Gideon, sorry if I confuse those two names, Gideon then sort of rallies those people, and they are the army that's now pursuing them. So these people now kick in sort of the second part of the story here. And they're pursuing them. Now this red arrow from the south that comes up, this is the tribe of Ephraim. He's already sent word down to Ephraim, and he has them go down to the region of Jericho. Remember, Israel's conquered Jericho. That's one of their cities. And he sends them down there, and he wants to make sure that the fords or the places to cross the Jordan River are cut off from the Midianites, so that they can't do a fast retreat on their camels. So they go down and they cut them off. So the Midianites then flee. They go up this valley where Succoth and Peniel are, and they're heading out here onto the sort of the Jordanian heights. And you see the red lines there. They're the ancient highways. What they're fleeing for is they're trying to get on the major trade routes so that they can use their camels and really make speed here and get away from the Israelites. Somewhere in that route there, Gideon and the Israelites are able to overtake them. It's not a complete victory, but they're able to capture the kings. So the leadership is gone. They've got their kings, and they bring them back. Then Midian then comes back. That's the dotted arrow, and this is when he extracts his revenge on Peniel and Succoth, on those cities there. We come now to this second scene in chapter 3, and this is the throne. After conquering and defeating the Midianites, the people of Israel then come up to Gideon. They say, you should be king over us. Now, one of the big things is in Joshua and Judges, God tells the people of Israel, you shall have no king like all the other nations, for I, the Lord your God, am your king. Now, what's really good here is Gideon, in verse 23, has good theology. He says, I will not rule over you. The Lord your God, or the Lord, will rule over you. And so on the one hand, he says the right thing. God will rule over you. On the other hand, he makes a mistake here. He says, but I will ask this. I want everybody to give me an earring that they took off the bodies of the dead Midianites. Give me an earring. You know, every man, if you've got one of these earrings, give it to me. And he has enough then to make this ephod, which is like an apron that a priest would wear, and he sets it up in his hometown of Ophrah. Now remember, he destroyed the temple to Baal there, but he made a new temple. And we're not told exactly what's going on here, but it looks like Gideon is seeing himself as a person who's now going to mediate between Yahweh and the people and have sort of like this priestly altar site there at Ophrah. And it tells us in the story that this then became a real curse or a problem for the city of Ophrah. This became a huge issue there. Now, afterward, there's sort of an afterward to this story, and it comes in chapter 9. It's like an apron. The priest would wear it. No, it's just really, really fancy. The priest would wear it, you know, kind of like Father Eric, you know, puts on his Sunday best every week, you know, and you know, it's liturgical, it's ceremonial, along those lines. In chapter 9, Abimelech, who is Gideon's son, now rises to power, and he actually goes up to the people because Gideon's got sons, and they've got other people in the town of Ophrah there. Relatives, aunts, uncles, nephews, and stuff like that. And so their town and their clan has really risen to power within Israel. And Abimelech comes up and he says, look, what's better for you? For me, one person, to rule all of Israel, or for these 70 other people to do it? And they kind of say, well, it'd be better if we had one ruler. You can be our king. And so Abimelech then goes and kills 70 members of his household. And then he finds out that another one of the towns don't like this. And so he goes against that town, and there's this story where the people fled into sort of a stronghold with a tower in it. And instead of attacking it, he actually gets a lot of wood and piles against outside, and he burns them. So it says that he killed 1,000 people that day in this one town. And then another town says, well, we really don't like the way he's doing this. And so Abimelech goes against that town. Everybody flees into the stronghold. Abimelech gathers all the wood with his army, and they're going to burn this city. And one of the women, as they're carrying the wood over to it, throws a milling stone out of the tower window, and it crushes Abimelech's head. And Abimelech dies. But Abimelech ruled for 3 years. But it took this other prophet, judge, to warn the people of Israel about Abimelech and what he was doing. That kind of started this revolt about the whole thing here. So what starts with a great story with Gideon obeying God and raising up deliverance and all of his teachings and contending against Baal ends up with a situation at the very end of the story where Abimelech, his son, is as bad as the Midianites that were raiding from the countryside. So it's one of these where God starts off really high in the story, and by the end he's completely absent. Gideon starts off this great courageous warrior at the very beginning, really doing, show me the do, what about this, what about that, go down to the camp, listen to the people there. And he ascends, and by the very end of the story there, his son is now in charge and is doing these horrendous things. So, summary about the whole thing. What does the story of Abimelech teach us? On the one hand, it's a story about Gideon and his 300 men and the fleeces and the routing of the Midianites. So on the one hand, it's this great story to tell. On the other hand, there's some very, very strong theological themes in this story. First, the book of Judges is written during a time where it was very, very desperate times. You have armies and kingdoms and all sorts of people invading Israel. It's a very, very violent time, both from oppressors outside and from people inside of Israel. It's a really tough time to live. What's interesting about this is that when you look at the founding of the nation of Israel, the Old Testament doesn't put it in really glossy, great, rose-colored lenses. It's kind of like, when we lived in England, we'd always get into this all the time, because we have this great story about the founding of the United States with the Pilgrims and then the Constitutional Convention and the American Revolutionary War. And the British would look at us and go, it seems like you're starting the story of America halfway through. Because they have to back up much earlier to the 100 or almost 200 years when the United States was a colony of England and a colony of Spain. And so they back up and they look at what's taking place there with the French and Indian Wars and all this sort of stuff. And they say, you guys always gloss over that part, and then you jump in there. And so you go to England and you start going, wow, there's a lot more to this story than is going on. But the United States is just not the United States, but just about every country. I mean, you look at Cuba with the death of Castro. I mean, Castro is painted in really rose-colored glasses now. But when you look at the Old Testament, what's interesting is the founding of the nation of Israel is not portrayed that way. It's actually portrayed really quite brutally honest. The second thing is, this story clearly teaches that God is the one who delivers Israel. God is the one who they should worship. And when they stray off that tangent, they get into big trouble. And it goes back to the Shema. Hear, O Israel, I, the Lord your God, am one, and you shall worship the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So this story brings us right back to that. And the way it does it is by showing how God contends against Baal and these foreign enemies and gods, and what happens when we lose focus on God and we shift it more to like human deliverers. So we've actually gone, no, actually we're pretty good. Yeah, I mean, you come down to the New Testament. There's only one person who gets off scot-free in the whole Bible, and that's Jesus. And even with Jesus, you have people accusing him of things. Perhaps one of the big ones coming up to Easter is in the Gospel, as you read through the story, and you constantly hear this accusation. We know who your mother and brothers are, but we don't know who your father is. In other words, you're an illegitimate bastard. And that's the accusation that's constantly brought through, because this whole Christmas story with Mary conceiving by the Holy Spirit and Joseph then having to take her is one that casts a negative light over him from his birth all the way up to the end. So even with the story of Jesus, you get these accusations that are coming through. And as you were saying, we know it's true because I else would tell the story in such an unflattering light. You go to like Islam with the Quran. You can't say anything negative about Muhammad, blessed be his name, type thing. Yeah, you have to say that every time you say his word. But there's nothing negative that went on. In fact, the Muslims will even tell you that they venerate Moses and David and Jesus better than we do because we say horrible things about them. And so this is one of the things I think that's great in this whole story is instead of setting up our heroes as people to be worshipped, we realize we can relate to Gideon because we realize, A, he did something that really took a lot of courage, that he did have good theology, but like all of us, he botches it and blows it at different points in his life. Unfortunately for him, he did it at kind of a very strategic time historically, and it resulted with tragic consequences. Right. They're okay because it's not real. It's just on YouTube. Yes, yeah, dogs make a big mess. Okay, we got it, Kurt? All right. We'll close there, and if you have any other questions, you can ask me out getting coffee.